Welcome, colleagues. I think it's time that we start this webinar. So on behalf of the Health, Law and Ethics Research Interest Group at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, I warmly welcome you to today's webinar on global solidarity in health, understanding the new pandemic treaty. We are honored to host this important conversation in the wake of the World Health Assembly's adoption of the WHO pandemic agreement earlier this year. This marks a significant moment in the evolution of international health law, one that raises critical questions about equity, access, and the global distribution of responsibility in times of crisis. We are delighted to be joined by two distinguished scholars, Dr. Mariki Botha and also Dr. Mustaqim de Gama. We look forward to your engagement as we collectively reflect on the promises and limitations of this new treaty and the possibilities it offers for a more just and coordinated global response to future pandemics. So, colleagues, I'll now give over to my colleague, Ms. Aliki Edgecombe, who will introduce our speakers.
Hello, everyone, again. And as Professor Thalda says, I'm Aliki Edgecombe. I'm also part of the Health Law Research Interest Group. And it is my delight to introduce to you Dr. Mariki Botha, who is a legal scholar and science communicator with a unique background that bridges law, biotechnology, and ethics. After a 20-year career as a practicing attorney specializing in health law and biotechnology, she transitioned to academia, where she now focuses on interdisciplinary research at the intersection of science, technology, law, and ethics. She holds degrees of B.Proc, an LLB, an LLM in intellectual property law, an LLD in biotechnology law, and her research spans a range of critical topics. These includes the regulation of regenerative medicines, such as gene therapies and stem cell research, health data governance, pandemic preparedness, and digital health technologies. Her current work pays particular attention to emerging technologies such as brain-computer interfaces and the implications for fundamental rights, including mental privacy, online behavioral manipulation, and digital constitutionalism. Dr. Botha is currently based at the Penseli Neuroscience Lab at the University of Texas at Austin, where she is engaged in cutting-edge research under the Bridge Project. Her work focuses on the regulation and protection and governance of brain data, contributing to the development of equitable data governance frameworks for neuroscience. She has published extensively on these themes in both national and international academic journals, and has also served as co-editor of two prominent special editions, Digital Ethics in Humanities and Social Science Communications Journal, and Legal and Ethical Reforms of Neurotechnology Advancement in the Global South in Frontiers in Human Neuroscience. Dr. Botha is an elected board member of the Association for Responsible Research and Innovation in Genome Editing and the Academy of Science of South Africa, where she contributes to the second consensus study on gene therapies. She also served as an invited expert and co-author of the South African country reports on COVID-19, contributing legal analysis related to pandemic management. As a country representative for South Africa in the African Bioethics Network, she plays an active role in advancing bioethics discourse across the African continent. Beyond academia, Dr. Botha is a passionate science communicator. Through the use of comics and participatory storytelling, she engages diverse audiences in conversations around biomedical and digital ethics, promoting public awareness and encouraging inclusive debate. But most importantly, in her free time, she is a dedicated musician and performs with the Western Cape Flute Choir. So without further ado, we're going to be handing over now to Dr. Botha. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aliki. Thank you for that kind words. And of all those, the flute playing gives me the biggest headaches, I must say. So let me get myself set up, share my screen. Okay, so good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, wherever you may find yourself. And thank you, Aliki, for all those kind words. Today, I'll be discussing the concept of equity in the context of global pandemic preparedness, specifically focusing on the hot off the presses 2025 World Health Organization Pandemic Agreement. In this instance, I'll be using South Africa as a case study, and I'll explore how equity can move from rhetorical comments to legal and institutional reality, and where the current gaps lie. So the 2025 World Health Organization Pandemic Agreement is a landmark initiative aiming to institutionalize equity as a central global health principle. But what does this actually mean in practice, especially for a country like South Africa with existing inequalities in health access as well as in infrastructure? So in this talk, I'll examine equity not just as a value, but as an operational obligation, how it's defined in the agreement, how it was tested during COVID-19, and what legal and institutional reforms South Africa would need to align itself with this particular vision. We'll also discuss how domestic preparedness is essential for global equity to be actually realized. So, with regards to the definitions, the World Health Organization Agreement defines equity as the absence of unfair, avoidable, or remediable differences in health outcomes or access. So, this is not just a moral ideal. It is actually codified in Articles 2 and 3, and then reinforced in Chapter 2 with phrases like, quote, the world together equitably, unquote. However, equity here is not a standalone concept. It's tied to key mechanisms such as access to healthcare systems, equitable research and development efforts, local production capabilities, and benefit sharing. So Articles 6 through 14 touch on many of these aspects, and we'll have a look at them later on. And yet we'll see how their enforceability still remains a concern. So one of the most concerning issues is the use of so-called soft legal language throughout the agreement. You get terms like as appropriate or subject to resources, which may dilute obligations and simply make equity aspirational rather than binding. So this poses a risk that equity may become merely a symbolic commitment rather than an actionable standard. Therefore, the translation of these norms into enforceable domestic laws and the political will to implement them, which is very important, becomes absolutely critical. Without legal benchmarks or measurable indicators, equality risks becoming merely a checkbox term or a checkbox exercise. So let's start from the lessons we learned from COVID-19, particularly in South Africa. The COVID-19 pandemic revealed deep vulnerabilities in all health systems. Despite strong advocacy for TRIPS waivers to gain access and affordable access to vaccines, both by South Africa and in collaboration with India, South Africa still experienced delayed access to vaccines and diagnostics throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. Procurement processes in these aspects were often very opaque, and there was significant executive overreach, raising questions about accountability. Yet, one bright spot was the role of civil society, and of course, our strong constitutional mechanisms. So through litigation, public pressure, and media, civil society played a crucial role in advocating for equitable access as well as transparency. So these lessons showed us that legal as well as societal oversight are essential for making equity real. Article 3 deals with normative ambiguity, or it contains normative ambiguity. It contains several normative aspirations, including the call to so-called strengthen trust in science, but it lacks clarity on how this is to be done or which institutions are actually responsible for doing so. Again, language like as appropriate or where applicable creates massive legal ambiguity, allowing states to cherry pick and choose their level of compliance to suit their goals and needs. Ironically, the language of equity can also be used to justify exclusion. For example, if a country prioritizes their national populations without broader solidarity. We've seen this happening in the COVID-19 pandemic with vaccine hoarding by various countries. In this context, it makes equity vulnerable to selective implementation and performance compliance. Articles 10 through 14 covers some of the most substantive mechanisms for achieving equity, which include local manufacturing and supply chain. In South Africa, I can really commend the work done by Afrigen and Biovac. Technology transfer, of course, you can only use the local plants for production if you have the know-how about how to produce vaccines. And the World Health Organization pathogen access and benefit sharing, or the so-called PABS system, which is kind of revolutionary because it kind of obligates countries to include benefit sharing in this context for human health purposes, as opposed to the Nagoya Protocol, who merely codifies it for non-human purposes. However, these mechanisms remain largely voluntary and non-binding, which is problematic. There is limited clarity on timelines, responsibilities, or even enforcement procedures if people simply choose not to adhere to them. So without some hard obligations, these provisions may lack traction, especially when powerful states or big pharmaceutical companies and their interests push back, like we have seen happening during the COVID-19 pandemic. So South Africa's efforts in building local capacity are promising at this stage, but global equity needs enforceable cooperation. So true equity requires much more than just access. It requires also freedom of thought, expression, and oversight. In South Africa, some of you may have been familiar with episodes like the Glenda Gray or the ivermectin controversies, which reveal deep attempts to suppress dissent, often in the name of unity of science. But dissent in this context is essential for epistemic trust and democratic legitimacy. The World Health Organization does not, in this regard, adequately protect scientific independence or freedom of expression, which are foundational for public trust. Therefore, embedding protections for democratic deliberation and media freedom is crucial for genuine equity. To operationalize equity, South Africa must undergo legal and institutional reforms, including some of the following. And many of these reforms I'm going to mention here has been discussed and listed in detail in the South African COVID country reports, of which you see the front page there. So some of these reforms may include modernizing intellectual property law to align with public health imperatives, increasing transparency in procurement and budgeting during these health emergencies, legally embedding equity in pandemic preparedness laws and health statutes, and fostering cross-departmental coordination, particularly between health, trade, and science ministries. And lastly, but not least, empowering civil society and watchdog institutions to provide meaningful oversight. So equity must not just be promised by means of a piece of paper. It must be embedded in laws and practices to ultimately make it enforceable and hold people accountable for it. So the biggest question is, what is the way forward? South Africa should adopt a constitutional approach of equality or equity in public health emergencies, making it justiciable. Laws must mandate benefit sharing, which it currently does not do for human health services or health research, and local manufacturing commitments must be done in South Africa, including public accountability mechanisms. Internationally, South Africa should advocate for stronger enforcement tools in this World Health Organization framework. Legal triggers, peer review, and multilateral accountability. So in short, South Africa must not only demand equity from others, but also model it right here from her through governance that is fair, transparent, and inclusive. So in conclusion, the World Health Organization pandemic agreement is a great starting point, but it's not a guarantee. It sets the stage, but it's up to member states to translate these aspirations into law, policy, and actual practice. South Africa has both the potential as well as the moral authority to lead by example in this regard. But as with many things, this will require political courage, legal reform, and sustained engagement from civil society. So as I argue throughout this presentation, equity must be built at home to work globally. So with this, I thank you for your time and attention. And I'd like to leave you with a quote from John Rawls from his work, A Theory of Justice. He says that justice is the first virtue of social institutions, as truth is of systems of thought. And to add my own spin on it, institutional equity must be foundational, not ornamental. So for this, I welcome your thoughts, questions, and reflections. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Burtis. And just to remind everyone that they're very welcome to use the chat feature just to pop any questions that they have on what Dr. Burtis has said. And now Dr. Gama, who I'm going to be handing over to, please make use of it, and we will have a Q&A time at the end. So I'm now going to be handing over to Dr. Gama, but before I do that, I'm going to be reading out his bio. So Dr. Mustaqim Gama is an accomplished international trade law expert, legal strategist, and thought leader in the fields of intellectual property and global health diplomacy. He holds a doctoral degree in international economic law and served as an extraordinary professor at the University of Pretoria from 2010 to 2015. He previously served as Director of the Legal International Trade and Investment Directorate at South Africa's Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, where he led the legal advisory work on trade negotiations, investment frameworks, and intellectual property in the context of the South African Development Community, that's the SADC, and the SADC EU Economic Partnership Agreement, and the AFCFTA. On the international stage, Dr. Gama represented South Africa as a counselor at the Permanent Mission to the United Nations and the World Trade Organization in Geneva. In his role, he was deeply engaged in negotiations on development, dispute settlement, trade-related investment measures, fisheries subsidies, and intellectual property issues at the WTO's TRIPS Council. He was a key contributor to the negotiations that culminated in the historic 2022 World Trade Organization TRIPS decision on COVID-19 vaccines, advocating for equitable access to medical technologies. Dr. Gama also co-chaired the World Health Organization's Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator Working Group on Therapeutics and Diagnostics, where he collaborated with global partners to tackle legal and policy barriers to equitable access during the pandemic. He currently works as an independent researcher and consultant in the areas of international trade law, intellectual property, and access to medicines, contributing to global policy debates on innovation, public health, and inclusive development. Thank you very much, Dr. Gama. The floor is yours.
Chair, thanks very much for this very generous introduction. I'll quickly share my screen. And also, let me thank everyone who's joined this conversation. Mariki has given us a good overview of some of the provisions of the pandemic treaty. And what I will try to do is really to take a wider perspective on some of the equity issues, and of course, the interaction between the pandemic treaty and other international instruments. I think this shaped the outcome on many of the discussions, but I also want to embed it in a perspective that places the pandemic treaty on solid ground as a first of its kind, pointing out some of the shortcomings as Mariki has done, but also being optimistic about how this particular treaty could be, through ownership, through inclusivity, taken to the next level. And so from that perspective, I want to go a little bit wider and also embed Africa in this debate, because I feel that there are wider issues that need to be addressed. So from this perspective, we know that during COVID, we had this particular saying, no one is safe until everyone is safe. And this essentially fell on deaf ears because ultimately developed nations took a large share of the access to available medical countermeasures. And as a result, many of the developing nations were very much at the back of the line. And so from this perspective, there are certain lessons that we have to learn and embed and ask ourselves whether or not we have learned to include them in treaties such as the pandemic treaty. And so from that perspective, Mariki also spoke about issues around denial of access, the hoarding of vaccines at that time, and then also the actions of governments that acted in their national capacity, and that essentially countermanded what could be done internationally. Also, as pointed out, there is a great emphasis in the treaty on voluntary approaches, including voluntary licenses where technology transfer is concerned. However, we know that there were many problems with the application of voluntary licenses in the context of a pandemic, and we know the institutional failures that resulted from this. So in terms of the evolving normative landscape, how should we see the outcome embedded in the pandemic treaty? Firstly, I believe the treaty is a significant boost in the arm for multilateralism, because having been involved in various stages of the negotiation, in some of the advice dispensed to the South African government, it wasn't always certain that there would be an outcome. And so I think the political, geopolitical fragmentation that we've seen escalated towards the end of the Biden administration and into the so-called Trump 2 administration really put the cat amongst the pigeons, and essentially also brought forward the North-South interaction. And so from that perspective, the changing landscape and the trade wars has had a fundamental impact on the ability of countries, groups of countries, to ensure that there are equitable outcomes. Also, the trade policies of significant economic blocs have also put certain barriers in the way of establishing global equitable manufacturing capacity. I'll maybe speak about this a little bit later on. The treaty does touch on aspects around research and development, around supply chains, procurement, and so forth. However, this is not strong enough, and of course, countries have to take some sort of responsibility in how they execute this. As I said, sovereignty has played a big role in COVID-19, and I think going forward, this is also a perspective because the pandemic treaty does emphasize sovereignty above many of the areas where there could be cooperation. And ultimately, there is some sort of soft law evolving, but this has to be assessed. Now, of course, we've already spoken about why it was necessary to have a pandemic treaty, but really, how have the lessons been embedded in the pandemic treaty? And I think I'm trying to speak about this from a very positive perspective, given the fact that we have international law as a system, and I think the evolution of norms have to be seen in this light, that we may start with a non-binding situation, but the evolving consensus over time may result in more binding outcomes, given the fact that there is this potential for global cooperation. So the need for global coordination, I believe that this has been solidly tackled in the treaty because there is a provision that establishes a conference of the parties, and this body will have a very important role in operationalizing and expanding the nascent consensus that was reached in the treaty. I also believe that the substantive provisions at least create a hook for rapid and transparent information sharing. However, those details still have to be sorted out. So, for instance, on the PAB system, as Mariki indicated, there will be additional negotiations through an intergovernmental working group to finalize those particular provisions. Equity and solidarity, of course, there are various chapters that deal with this, but the operationalization is still something to speak about. Now, what has been forgotten or what has been watered down? I believe that the issue around access to vaccines and therapeutics have been forgotten in some sort of way. However, one has to look at it from the geopolitical context, and certainly mechanisms around equitable access, including production, pool procurement. These are rather loose, but could be tightened over time. And I will speak about the processes through which that could be possible. Technology transfer, once again, very loose. The intellectual property flexibilities, especially embedded in the TRIPS agreement, are not fully embedded or are subject to the invocation of national capacities. The enforcement issues possibly are not as good as they should be. And then, of course, inclusive multi-stakeholder participation is something that needs to be further assessed. Now, there is also an interaction with another instrument that has recently been passed, the International Health Regulations. And this particular instrument is very much procedural, but it does supplement and, of course, interact with the pandemic treaty. And so from that perspective, we just need to take cognizance of that relationship. But given the fact that we have limited time, there are a few things that I want to talk about. The one is the interaction between the normative frameworks that shape the health outcomes prioritized in the pandemic treaty. Now, of course, when we do talk about international health policy, this interacts with many other norms, including issues around trade, human rights, environment, intellectual property, and so forth. And so this table really just establishes some of the points of intersection, such as the CBD Convention through the Nagoya Protocol. And we've seen very difficult discussions around the access and sharing mechanisms for pathogens. For example, the TRIPS agreement. I've said very little about the so-called TRIPS waiver. But once again, these are norms that intersect and are very, very difficult to reach consensus on. We have the human rights dimension, the right to health and non-discrimination that needs to be taken into account. And then, of course, as I said, the international health regulations. Now, so specifically, I just quickly wanted to apply a bit of a law and economics perspective, specifically game theory to the outcome. And what we see in the outcome is that, there are two parties, and let's put it around a north-south axis, where around core themes of cooperation, such as IP sharing, vaccine equity, tech transfer, governance, and public funding, we would see specific approaches taken by parties, and I won't go through all of them, but for example, on IP sharing, we have a reaction from the North that it will hoard intellectual property, and the South, not having access, will request access. And ultimately, what happens is that the North will stockpile and will retain technology. And ultimately, this harms the international consensus. And of course, this affects millions and billions of people. And so ultimately, there may be a remedy, binding IP waiver mechanisms, for example, open access, open science. But this is an evolving debate that has not been settled, and that will not be settled at the World Health Organization per se. But nonetheless, I think there is a platform for the intersectionality of this debate. And it's exactly the same with technology transfer. What is advocated is voluntary approaches, but nonetheless, what happens in this situation is that developing countries will not have access to the type of technology that they require, and as a result, they will not be able to either prepare or be resilient in pandemics of the future. And so from that perspective, what is the best approach forward? Well, the best approach forward is that future pandemics will happen. And so there needs to be institutional mechanisms that will enable parties to access the best medical countermeasures within appropriate periods of time, and create the necessary institutional mechanisms to address these, including mandatory benefit sharing, transparency on public funding especially. I think the treaty does make a start on those processes. So in concluding, what is the way forward? So equity by design does not mean charity, but duty. And I think this is something that we have to take to heart. States have a duty to act in their sovereign capacity. And as a result, this is quite an important aspect. So I think as has been advocated already, equity has to be embedded as a legal obligation, and there's many ways of doing this. Open licensing and publicly funded research and development, this goes a long way in addressing the shortcomings and lack of capacity in lower middle income countries. It's already been mentioned that the mRNA hub, which is hosted at Afrigen, has made a massive difference to the capacities and the transfer of technology based on very innovative funding and technology licensing provisions. Also, coordination with other norms is going to be important. Fair and transparent procurement systems would also have to be implemented. Governance oversight, as Marikia has also indicated, is going to be very important to ensure that the necessary norms and capacity building is embedded, and then also the involvement of civil society and LMIC involvement. Now, what would be a consensus model that one could put forward in this context? Well, if we look at the learnings from other international instruments, we see, for example, in the UNFCCC and the CBD, we see the progressive adoption of protocols and implementation mechanisms. And so this establishes a dynamic governance structure. And so this is also the basis on which you could revise and adopt and implement additional protocols. Also, the work of subsidiary bodies are very important in establishing technical standards, which at the moment has not been agreed with, and also equity-based differentiation. So developing countries taking less of the strain, and this is actually in line with the common but differentiated responsibility. Also, very important is that sometimes you can mix voluntary and binding aspects under a treaty, and a very good example of this is the Montreal Treaty in the context of climate change, which is binding, but the Paris Agreement is non-binding, so they can coexist, and so treaties can adopt tiered commitments, and of course in addressing this, flexibility and adaptability will be quite important as we continue to advocate for benefit sharing, for IP licenses, for digital sequence data and regional production. And of course, the role of dialogue and dispute settlement should also be emphasized. Just very quickly on the African front, there is a lot happening. I think these slides kind of indicate the progress that has been made by the AU through the Africa CDC in operationalizing various centers of excellence. I'm going to leave it there, but these slides will be made available. And then, of course, the operationalization of institutions, national regulators, the African Medicines Agency, and then also regional capacity building and centers for pharmaceutical technology foundations. These have all been set up, and I believe that they are running from the interactions that we've been having. South Africa's issues have been addressed, so I'm not going to say too much, except to say that the failure to reform the IP laws has had a marked impact on access to medicines, and we've seen this during the HIV/AIDS era, and also with COVID-19, and so ultimately, the case that was decided recently has also implications for the way we deal with contracts and the transparency around these. So in conclusion, we have to understand that the treaty remains weak and unenforceable in many respects, but it is a platform in institutionalizing global cooperation. I also believe that the treaty offers a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to rebalance the pharmaceutical production landscape, which has already begun and has gathered a lot of steam. Also, it is an opportunity to bridge power asymmetries and to ensure coherence across various regulatory platforms, which includes the TRIPS flexibilities and the Nagoya Protocol. And then, of course, over time, the treaty will support the normalization of equitable global health standards, capacity sharing, and ethical obligations across borders, but only if member states recommit to global responsibility beyond sovereignty-driven nationalism. I'll stop here. Thank you very much, and happy to take any questions. Back to you, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much, Dr. de Gama. You've given us so much to think about. And it's now an opportunity for our audience, our attendees, to chip in and add their comments and questions to both you and Dr. Burtis. And for this, I'm going to be handing over to Ms. Devarasi Bellinger, who is also part of our team here at UKZN, part of the Health Law and Research Interest Group. And so she's been monitoring the chat and the Q&A. You're very welcome to keep posting. Everybody's on this call is welcome to keep posting, and we will be feeding your questions through to Dr. de Gama and Dr. Burtis. So thank you very much, Dev, and I'm going to be handing over to you.
Thanks, Aliki. And I want to take this opportunity to thank our panelists for two very interesting and thought-provoking presentations. There are a few questions in the chat, but before we get to that, I have 3 questions that were drafted and sent to us as part of the registration for this webinar, and I'm going to start with those. I am going to pose the questions to both our panelists, and if we can have some feedback from first Dr. Burtis, followed by Dr. de Gama, that would be great. So I'm going to start off with the first question. The first question is as follows. May I inquire as to what the opinion of the panelists are regarding the influx of non-registered pirate medications smuggled into South Africa and dispensed by some HCPs for a greater profit? What can be done about it?
Right. That wasn't really a problem during the COVID-19 pandemic, or the main problem during the COVID-19 pandemic. There are rules and regulations and legislation that govern uncertified or medication in that regard. So that could always be strengthened. But I suppose that was a question during the COVID-19 pandemic, is with the quick development of vaccines, what the overarching rules and regulations with regards to safety and efficacy with regards to those vaccines were. But that is something that needs to be strengthened, and there needs to be triggers to trigger those overarching rules. And yes, that's a concern during pandemics, when things needs to happen very quickly. But I think the PAP system and the sharing of data with regards to that could help a lot. And I've seen further questions with regards to the PAP system, which is that was kind of the linchpin of the pandemic agreement, is the sharing of pathogens and pathogen data, etc., which will greatly affect the development of vaccines. Whether that will work if push comes to shove during a pandemic, it remains to be seen, because big pharma, and especially the US withdrawing from the World Health Organization, is a big problem. So immediately we have those thrifts internationally, those who are willing to collaborate and those who are just pulling back and not collaborating. To counter this, I think the biggest issue is local production and local capacity. We need to develop this. We have a great start with Afrigen, as Mustaqim indicated. That's a great start, but it's simply not enough. We need to build forward on that. And the irony is, when the next pandemic comes around, the previous generation who investigated all these things, who lived through the pandemic, may have forgotten the level of collaboration necessary to fight a pandemic. So I firmly believe local production, local creation of know-how is very important to fight the next pandemic. But over to you, Mr. Kim.
Yes, thanks. I think, with the influx of so-called non-registered private medical products, there is this concept of, marketing authorization, that anything that is imported into South Africa would first have to be authorized if that's the case. Now, if these products are entering the market, of course, they are entering the market in an illegal way, and they would be subject to enforcement measures. And so ultimately, I think this is a question of enforcement, because the policy is very clear on how products enter the market. Now, what is also important to understand is that during situations of pandemics, as Mariki has indicated, you do have emergency use authorizations, but these are far and few between. And I think the history kind of indicates that these are exceptional measures. So I don't think that many of these so-called importation issues relate necessarily to a lack of policy. I think it's a lack of capacity and enforcement. If you look at the African continent, we import well over 80% of all our medical needs, 99% of all our vaccine needs. And so I would also concur the best way to counter importation of spurious, counterfeit medical products is really to have local production subject to regulatory oversight that establishes acceptable levels of safety, efficacy, and so forth. And so, this is part of a very long discussion around so-called counterfeit medicines. How many of these products coming into the market are essentially effective, safe, and so forth. Let me leave it at that. There are issues around the PAB system, which I want to come back to, but maybe when that question is posed.
Thank you, Dr. Gama. I wanted also just to comment as to whether what you mentioned about stronger IP protection might also have an impact in counteracting the influx of pirate medication, but I think you dealt with that. So the next question is, I think one that has already been canvassed in some by both the panelists, but I'm going to ask the question anyway. How can the 2025 WHO pandemic agreement incorporate global solidarity principles to ensure equitable resource distribution and effective compliance amongst nations during health emergencies? Dr. Borges?
Right, to kick off, this is one of personally my biggest concerns. It's still voluntary. I fear that it may again repeat what happened during the COVID-19 process. It tries on paper to create an equitable standard or to institutionalize equity. The PAP system and the sharing of pathogens and data definitely tries to overcome this. But as I say, the proof is in the pudding, and the best defense is offense. And by that, I mean create local capacity and knowledge and stuff like that. So it remains to be seen whether that could actually change anything going forward. I'm very skeptical with regards to that. Over to you, Mr. Kim.
Yes, I think, Mariki, you're quite right. The operationalization of access is still something that needs to be hardwired, if I can put it that way. And unfortunately, we do have a north-south dynamic where nations that have more resources will be able to take a bigger portion of this pie. And so I think in the interim, what needs to be done, and specifically from the perspective of the African continent, we have an Agenda 2063, which is essentially the Africa we want. And as part of the implementation of this agenda, we have an objective of achieving so-called health and medical security. And so this is very high up on this agenda. And the only way that we will be able to ensure access is really to invest in those areas that will yield concrete results. Now, having been involved in the last 2 or 3 years in the mRNA hub and the kind of relationships that are built, I clearly see that knowledge is not the issue. I think the networks that exist on the ground in South Africa, on the African continent, are second to none. The scientists that we have are second to none, but there are barriers that impact the ability to deliver appropriate medical countermeasures, including appropriate vaccines. And so those barriers have to be addressed in a way that firstly achieves the equity. Many of our governments having the ability to invoke compulsory licenses have not done so. We have those flexibilities under international law. South Africa has not done so. South Africa has not changed its intellectual property laws to ensure, firstly, that patents are not filed that are not worth the paper they're written on, because this creates a really, really big problem around innovation. It creates a phenomenon called evergreening, and it really complicates the patent landscape. It also does not ensure the freedom to operate, which many of the institutions that are working on more effective and affordable outcomes are not able to access, because these patents are a substantial barrier. And so ultimately governments are not willing to step in and say, well, we will issue a compulsory license or something like that, or a government use license if that were the case. So ultimately there are various mechanisms that can be used and that are not used. And so that conversation has to come online so that we can essentially plan better. The other thing is that we are a poor continent. The lack of things we see on the continent is not because we lack the will. We lack the resources, and we need to pool those resources from a regional perspective. It is only from that perspective that we create bigger markets. Our producers will not be able to make a particular product if there are not certain guarantees that their future production will be met, given the current investment cost around these activities. So local production doesn't just fall out of the sky. It is actually planned where economic, health, and other interests are integrated into a particular framework. Let me stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Borges. Sorry, Dr. Gama. And it's interesting that you mentioned the North-South divide, because the next question actually pertains to that. The question is as follows. African states are often underrepresented in global health governance. How does the governance structure of the WHO pandemic agreement ensure fair African participation and decision-making power? Dr. Borges, Dr. Gama, do you want to go?
Let me go first. That has always been a fundamental question. So it is not just that you should be around the negotiating table, but you should also have the necessary resources to negotiate an equitable outcome. And many times, countries, firstly, are underrepresented. Either they do not have national representatives that come to the meeting, or they have one representative that sits in all forums So you have working groups, you have bifurcated engagements, which means that the same person cannot be present in several concurrent discussions. How this problem is solved is really through regional representation. So Africa CDC will represent the AU and will have a coordinating function, and you will have a coordinator, for example, in this case, Ethiopia, and there will be common positions that are signed off by the ministers of health. And this has been the process. And even in light of this, it's very difficult to ensure that there are equitable outcomes. Also, in the negotiating process, you have different groups. So you may have the African group, but the African group may also be part of other subgroups, like the equity group, a group of countries that come together and they advocate for equity outcomes. And I think it's the same. It's the same for Latin America, for example. They will come together and they will advocate for particular outcomes. So I think ultimately the question of participation is very important. Also, where does this participation happen? Does capital or do capitals have inputs in the outcomes of position statements that are made? Every country has some sort of coordinating mechanism. For example, South Africa had the so-called ACTA group that actively advised on every aspect of the negotiations and getting text back, having expert inputs, and so forth. All of this costs money. And as a result of lack of resources and maybe lack of access to the right type of expertise, you may, and so this has to be solved through technical assistance and capacity building, and this requires money. And as we see in the text, many of those obligations are watered down to such an extent that they may not be worth much, but ultimately there is a recognition of different capacities.
Thank you, Dr.
Great.
Dr. Borges?
Yes, if I can just add to that, I fully agree with Mr. Kim. I think if we go back to the text and the PAP system, the idea behind it, just to defend it in a little bit, is equitable access to pathogen samples in real time, which is idealistic. But I think it goes far beyond just sharing pathogens and genetic sequences and data in this respect. I think the thinking behind the PAP system was also to correct historical imbalances. For decades, and we know this living in South Africa and in the global south, that many of our pathogen samples went to global institutions in the global north, and they contributed much to the development of medical products and such. So this PAP system, the thinking behind it, would reverse or try to reverse this trend to link access to pathogens with guaranteed benefits for the global south, or at least that was the idea behind it. Whether or not that will materialize during the next pandemic remains to be seen, and whether it would be actually institutionalized in practice remains to be seen. So if that sharing actually occurs as it is stated in the text, it will also, in theory, elevate local research and development capacity in the global south or in South Africa, and it will supposedly foster technology transfer, which is the idea behind it, which should strengthen local capacity. But as Mr. Kim said, it's the knowledge isn't necessarily the problem in South Africa, it's the resources. And I'm wondering, maybe Mr. Kim is in a better position to answer this with his international economical background, whether partnerships in this regard with companies, with whoever in the global north may not be able to strengthen this and provide at least resources to elevate local capacity, which I think remains one of the most important aspects in all of this. Thank you, Deverasi.
Thank you, Dr. Borges. So your answer and Dr. Gama's answer just prior to that answers a question raised by one of our attendees. Paul Esselar is also a member of our group, who asked also about this, how to avoid the recurrence of the money talks approach to vaccine procurement. There is a further question by Paul, which I am going to try and find in the chat and read to you. So Paul says, anecdotally, it will appear that some countries which had access to vaccines, such as the USA, did not do very well with responding to COVID. While vaccines are important, what is arguably more important is to get good quality data about pandemic to the public. During COVID, it was very difficult for the public, especially those with no medical background, to be able to filter useful information from fake, inaccurate, and misinformation. Moreover, there's significant distrust of the government institutions based on what occurred during COVID. Question is, what would be the best way to ensure good quality information is sourced and successfully communicated to the public? And does the WHO Pandemic Treaty deal with this issue? Dr. Borges?
Right, that is a very, very good question. I think there was significant distrust in government, and they tried to create mechanisms to actually communicate to the public. One of the biggest issues or initiatives was the COVID-19 alert app, where you can notify who you were in contact with. They also had WhatsApp groups and stuff like that to inform people about COVID, etc., etc. But there was a huge lack of trust in the government. So independent actors like the media plays a significant role in this to communicate from authority or reputable sources to the public. Becky Caesar, for example, from the media's perspective, fulfilled a huge role in this. But this brings me back to the whole issue around Glenda Gray, which is a scientist and who dissented with the government in certain aspects of lockdown regulations. And she was crucified for it, which the government needs platforms to better communicate to the public. The treaty doesn't necessarily address this, the pandemic agreement. They merely say that trust in science must be approved or improved. But it's hard to do or just to say that without mechanisms to actually do that. So we need reputable sources to actually communicate with the public. And that was one of the main findings when we drafted the South African COVID country report, is there seems to be very little of those platforms to really inform the public and to open up dialogue with the public and hear their voice as well and guide them through all these informations. I know Professor Saldar especially written extensively on the dissent and freedom of expression and freedom of speech. So, Donnie, I'm not sure whether you want to add anything to this conversation, if I dare to put you on the spot.
Thank you. I've been listening attentively, but I think that at this stage, I would rather choose not to go further into this rabbit hole, because I'm reading some of the other questions, and perhaps we should proceed to them rather in the chat. Very interesting questions, but thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, Donnie.
Perhaps maybe just my 2 cents worth. I think a lot of damage was done with misinformation during COVID-19, and the role that public platforms played in this regard. So from that perspective, we really have to think or rethink what our digital communication strategies should be and what type of action should be subject to further oversight and regulation, so that the appropriate levels of responsibility can be achieved for the different role players, including the media, social media platforms, and the like. And I believe that there are certain regulations that are starting to speak to that situation. But I also believe that the pandemic treaty does speak to communication and public awareness. And so each party must take the appropriate steps to ensure that there is scientific public health and pandemic literacy, which is embedded in the population. And each government has to essentially take those steps. But of course, there are many other counterpoints to this particular discussion. Suffice it to say that knowledge is contested. And so when we are looking at concepts such as the best science approach or best scientific principle, there will always be contestation. And I think in this space, things that look like a no-brainer because they are based on so-called scientific principles sometimes is not entirely what one should think or could think they would be. So there's not always an agreement on the clinical outcome that needs to be achieved. And because of this contestation, there's also a lot of political tension that is created in terms of how this conflict is resolved. But necessarily what the treaty does is it puts the obligation to educate and to regulate in the national domain. And of course, the World Health Organization does give the necessary support for countries to implement their country strategies.
Devarasi, I think you're muted.
My apologies. If Dr. Gama could just comment on this following question, because I think it does pertain to what Dr. Gama was discussing during his presentation. The next question is as follows. It appeared during COVID that the pharmaceutical companies essentially had governments over a barrel in the sense that they disclaimed liability for anything that occurred as a result of the vaccine. On the one hand, there should be some sympathy for these companies as the timeline for the production of the vaccines was dramatically shortened. On the other hand, a complete indemnity for pharmaceutical companies allowed them to only reap profits without responsibility, even those responsibilities that they could have assumed given the timeline. Is there any way to deal with this somewhat ironic negotiating imbalance where governments are actually negotiating from an inferior position?
Devarashi, I think that is really a very, very good question. And it stems from the disparity in the power dynamic, because most of the big pharmaceutical companies that would have profited from COVID-19 are located in particular developed countries, and they have the backing of their governments. So I spoke about the issue of compulsory licenses and so forth, but countries that have tried to do that have come before the US Senate through the USTR and their so-called 301 measures, where they are put under pressure not to take these steps or not to issue compulsory licenses or not to reform laws where companies that are located in these jurisdictions have benefited. So it is not always a very straightforward debate to be had. But ultimately, yes, the pharmaceutical companies did have the upper hand in this situation. What could have been done differently and what should be done differently in future? I think the pandemic treaty already alludes to that. Firstly, transparency in pharmaceutical contracts. This is the first step towards ensuring that governments are held to account. Now, the Health Justice Initiative case that was heard in South Africa brought to light a few interesting dynamics. Firstly, it indicated that South Africa paid way more than developed countries for the same, or at least for much less of the vaccines that could be procured. secondly, the fact that there are secrecy clauses in these particular contracts does enable these companies to essentially divide up the international market. And so they could ask different prices for different jurisdictions. They are not obligated to disclose the true cost of production, for example. These are all issues. And even if they profited from public incentives, even if the product that they are now commercializing originated from government funding, they are not obligated to have so-called open access obligations in terms of those grants that they received. So ultimately, yes, these companies profited tremendously. The one thing that most of us possibly wouldn't understand or would not have had any knowledge about was the public liability aspects around the vaccines. And rightly so, these companies were very worried about whether or not they would be liable should there be adverse effects from the administration of these vaccines. And as a result, if you look at the clauses in these contracts, they obligate or request governments to create public liability funds. And essentially that is how they got away from having the corporate responsibility for any adverse effects. But long story short, these are things that we should treat with much circumspect. And I think going forward, there are now mechanisms and systems in place to require full transparency. And this is the first step towards addressing this inequity when it comes to the bargaining stance that these companies take.
Thank you, Dr. Gama. Dr. Bottas?
Yes, and I think just to add to that, I think this is where civil society and to a certain extent academia can also come into play to pressure for accountability, even to make aware or bring all this information to light, the power imbalances, etc. Because at this stage, the pandemic agreement, the negotiations for that, as well as the contracts between pharmaceutical companies and countries, are usually done behind closed doors. So that speaks to the transparency that Dr. de Gama spoke about. And that's why it's important that civil society then comes to the fore and demands transparency and accountability and demand the publication of draft texts, negotiation positions, a seat at the table perhaps, and become part of the conversation, so that you can inform people with the right information, which brings us back to mis and disinformation. So you can see it's an entire ecosystem which is driven by equity, transparency, accountability to ensure the institutionalization and the executability of this pandemic agreement. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question from Hussein Vada, who's one of our attendees, and it goes as follows. Dear panel, the main issue with respect to future pandemic, like Nimbus 2025, is not equity, but the challenge of the rise of anti-vaxxers amongst all sectors of the diverse South African society. Therefore, IP rights protection for new vaccines, which are written about, are presently irrelevant, as is vaccination for all, as they will be ardent vaccine objectors. Presently, there are numerous deaths in the geriatric population from the present bout of influenza and several complications. I would appreciate some comments from the panel as these issues need to be discussed. Thank you. Dr. Bottas, would you like to go first?
Yes, sure. This is directly a consequence of probably mis and disinformation, and it's a big problem that you create these pockets in social media where people echo one another and confirm dis and misinformation. But vaccine hesitancy or anti-vaxxers, you cannot change their minds by giving them more information. in the context of science communication, there's lots of research saying that you need to address this on an emotional level. So it's a combination of providing good information, grounded in science, but speaking to the emotions and the person of people, and then align the consequences of vaccines, because a lot of people do suffer from long-term COVID and consequences of vaccines, and align this with scientifically based information. So this again brings me back to civil society and information platforms that disseminate correct information to the correct people, and also give anti-vaxxers a platform or a voice to enter into debate with scientists, to clear up some of the uncertainties and to clarify some of the fears. So this is a process. It's not something you can change overnight. And hopefully, if you engage with them and you answer some of their fears, or you get to the bottom of this, you may change a few minds, not all of them, but this is a process going forward.
Thank you, Dr. Borges. Dr. de Gama, any comment on anti-vaxxers?
Yes, I think it's really a societal problem where it relates to information. As I said, knowledge is contested, and so appropriate avenues have to be found to ensure that we have good information that is disseminated large. Ultimately, what we need to ensure from a regulatory point of view is that we have the technological platforms and the responsibility of regulating those platforms, because ultimately what algorithms now do, what artificial intelligence does, is it disseminates information not as was in the past on a general public level, but it starts to individualize and pick up on individual preferences, and actively starts to push particular type of information to these individuals. So I think if there were 10 people and we read the same newspaper, we possibly could come to the same conclusion based on the information that we saw in the newspaper. However, with the differentiated approaches that these platforms allow, it is that I get an entirely different newsreel to you based on particular preferences. So this is a battle that will continue into the future. And the only way that we are able to address this is through building it into the active education. So the schooling system at every level of society having initiatives that really inculcate the best practice when it comes to health policy, and so forth.
Thank you, sir. We have a number of questions from David Curry, and he's asked me to start with his last one. I'm not sure if you would like to hear from Dr. Borges first, but the question goes as follows. Given all the continuing activity at country, member state, and global levels, what is the viable role for civil society in pushing forward the underlying imperatives of equity, benefits sharing, IP distribution, etc.?
As I said before, I really think the viable role of civil society is to push for transparency, to operationalize transparency, to demand a seat at the table, to demand publication of certain documents, to demand what is being negotiated between countries, between pharmaceutical industries. So I think they play a massive role in that, to actually initiate and to momentize the dialogue between stakeholders, and for them to represent the mere man on the street, and to get information from negotiations behind doors at this stage, and to disseminate it at proper, reputable, trustworthy platforms that is independent from governments, because of the huge distrust of governments, specifically in South Africa, as we've seen during the COVID-19 pandemic. And hopefully, if that dissemination of thoroughly vetted, scientifically based properly sourced information could be disseminated to the public at large, it will be a great first step to combat or to counter disinformation, misinformation. Maybe it would change the minds of anti-vaxxers or vaccine hesitants or whatever the case may be. So they can play a major role in that regard, I think. Thank you.
Dr. de Gama?
Yes, from my side, I think I would agree with Mariki. It's all about transparency, and maybe I just want to share a small story in how many of the multilateral outcomes are really negotiated between a few parties, but it is cloaked in the legitimacy of multilateral processes. For example, at the World Trade Organization, I was part of the conceptualization of the so-called TRIPS waiver. And one of the principles that we agreed to was that we would take the fight outside of the negotiating room, because the institutional processes will create embargoes. Documents cannot be shared outside of the organization, nor can they be shared with third parties until the negotiation is completed. And so what we decided to do was to engage outside of the room, engage with parliamentary oversight groups to give them the necessary information and oversight, to engage with civil society groups, and to work actively to have forums that disseminate that information. So I think access to information is quite important, and the processes by which this happens sometimes is curtailed within the institutional frameworks of these international organizations. And when the text is done and when it is out, it is a single undertaking and no one can do anything about it. And you would have ignored your core constituencies in the name of consensus. And ultimately, those processes have to be further embedded, that civil society gets a seat at the table, and not only gets a seat, but is able to voice concerns and have those concerns taken into account.
Thank you, Dr. de Gama. We have another question from David Curry to both presenters. And it asks, is it clear that the US withdrawal of engagement and support, and the suggestion that it will seek other like-minded countries to forge some form of parallel operational agreement, is this an existential challenge to the viability of the pandemic accord, even with its aspirational language, etc.? Dr. Boertes, if you will.
Yes, thank you. That's scary prospects. So recently the United States announced that they will not align specifically with certain of the IHR amendments, which kind of threatens the legitimacy of the IHR. And this is problematic because the US has been one of the biggest role players in the World Health Organization and with regards to these instruments, and they're also very well resourced. So many of the resources or the funding for the development, for example, of vaccines, etc., would have come from the US. So if they withdraw from these organizations and these treaties, it is highly problematic. What makes it complicated is that currently the situation or the political situation that resulted in these withdrawals is currently volatile or unstable. So they may change a lot still in future, or there may be no changes in future. It remains to be seen. But the difference for me between the international health regulations is that it's very important as a first responder, as a notifier of pandemics worldwide, and to trigger those emergency health regulations in countries, where the World Health Organization pandemic agreements got a longer view to ensure equity over a longer time period going forward. So if the US withdraws from these organizations and treaties and whatnot, it is really problematic. And if they form coalitions with different countries in opposition to it, it may really cause a divide, a worldwide divide, which will definitely not be in the best interest or to the benefit of global health, as we've seen in a pandemic. And Mr. opened his presentation so wonderfully that a pandemic cannot be stopped if everybody is not committed to stopping a pandemic. So this really threatens not only constitutional or institutional and treaty legitimacy, but also global health. Um, the, there remains many more questions than there is answers at the moment. So it remains to be seen what will happen next. I don't have a definitive answer with regards to this. Just to say that, again, coming back to civil society will play an increasingly important role to keep people updated with developments in this regard and to keep them informed from an independent source, so they at least can make their own decisions in this regard. Thank you.
Varashi,
Dr.
thanks
Guy.
very much.
Yeah.
I fully agree with Mariki on this. I think even in a wider context, if we were to take the international health regulations as a merely procedural agreement, it does put certain important pegs in the ground that countries have to that countries have to respect. And so the general withdrawal of the US from many international engagements and organizations, the World Health Organization is one, the World Trade Organization is another. It has essentially crippled that organization where nothing, absolutely nothing can be done. And so the question really is, how can multilateralism overcome the fact that one very important member of the international community has decided to do its own thing? There are many consequences from a resource perspective. However, I also think that recent actions on the side of the US, where they have incentives for relocation of pharmaceutical production, where this has been outsourced to countries like India and China, is starting to change the way countries see the policy perspective around this. So, for example, the EU is countering these actions and actually is stepping up to provide a little bit more funding. I also think that the axis, the north-south axis, has also shifted because China is becoming more important, a more important link in this whole chain. So as the US retreats, China will step into many of these let's say spaces that's been left by the US. So ultimately, I believe there will be a time where institutions and countries would have to adjust to the new normal, but over time, a new institutional framework will be built. So we will have a lot of instability that we don't really need at this point in time, but this will be overcome by a new normal that will be set. Now, from the World Health Organization perspective, we've seen the budget cuts and the retreat from oversight areas where there's just no money to do this. So this has to be addressed in the short term. We've also seen that many donor countries have cut their support. So donor fatigue is definitely not only on the side of the US, but on many of the donors. And ultimately, we have to figure out a way how to come together and use different mechanisms to try to sort this out. But I think given the fact that there has been a retreat from the international health regulations and how it's to be implemented, that is concerning. and that needs to be discussed more concretely in terms of the implementation plans that's been set for the regulations.
Maybe I can just add to what Mr. Kim said is maybe this is a call to action on a national or even a regional level to strengthen national collaboration instead of the infighting that happens so many times on a national level. And this again speaks to my initial sort of build local capacity. And I know there's resource constraints, but I think with national regional collaboration between public and private partnerships or whatever the case may be, slowly but surely we can work towards that. And I think ultimately that is what is necessary to become independent, but to come equal players in multilateral conversations, which Mr. Kim said, it's often led by one or two big players in the room and the rest just go along with it. Maybe it's now time to step up to the plate and use this as an opportunity. I think it was Churchill, I stand to be corrected, who said no crisis should be wasted as a good opportunity. So thank you.
All right, thanks, Dr. Burtis. That actually ties in quite nicely. I had one last question to ask of you, which you've actually covered brilliantly, in that the question asked is whether or not, beyond demanding transparency and finessing multilateral processes, it was now time for non-violent civil disobedience to force equity and benefits sharing. So I'm not sure if you want to add to that or whether you've already covered that in your last comment.
My answer is a resounding yes for the non-violence part especially. And I remember always my father told me that when you need a helping hand, look at the end of your arm. And it sounded very harsh for me when I was growing up. And now I understand, being grown, hopefully, that yes, maybe it's time for us to step up to the plate, make things happen, set our smaller differences aside, especially in the context of a pandemic, and collaborate, come together on national, regional levels and make something work, strengthen our own resources, pool it together, which does not mean we should not still collaborate with international partners, but maybe the shift in with who we collaborate with, there will be shifts there, but new alliances and new collaborations will be formed. But it's an opportunity I think we should grab with both hands. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That brings to an end our question and answer session. It's been very informative and interesting. I'm going to hand over to Professor Felder, who will provide us with some concluding remarks.
Colleagues, so as we draw this timely and thought-provoking webinar to a close, I want to sincerely thank our two experts, Dr. Mr. Kim de Gama and Dr. Mariki Burtis, for their insightful contributions. Thank you very much. You've each helped us unpack the complexities of the new WHO pandemic agreement, from its global legal dimensions to the implications it holds for South Africa's public health and policy landscape. Colleagues, I hope that today's conversation will serve not as a conclusion, but as a point of departure for further dialogue, critical reflection, and collaborative work across disciplines and across institutions. So let us carry forward the momentum from today's discussion and continue to shape the future of pandemic preparedness with both rigor and humility. Thank you for joining us. Stay well and stay engaged.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Take care.